Good morning, everyone. Malaysia and Singapore are two of the developing countries' most successful stories. The causes for their success and the implications of their success has in the past been well researched. But in more recent times, interest in these two countries appear to be fading. I'm Greg Lopez, a PhD scholar at the College of the Asia and Pacific. And today we have two experts on Malaysia and Singapore to talk to us about their interest in Malaysia and Singapore respectively, what motivates them, and why there is a continuing need to research these two countries. Rahim, Associate Professor at University of Sydney, you've been researching Singapore for at least 15 years now. What made you, what motivated you to research on Singapore?
Good morning, Greg. Nice to be here this morning. Well, I've always been interested in Singapore politics, in Southeast Asian politics. And when I was an undergraduate student, I did lots of subjects on Southeast Asian politics and history, and that further reinforced my interest in Singapore, Malaysian and Southeast Asian politics. I was also involved in student union activities when I was an undergrad student. I met lots of students from Southeast Asia, and that kind of gave me a helicopter understanding of Singaporean, Malaysian and Southeast Asian politics, and it whetted my appetite further, encouraged me to do postgraduate studies, my master's and eventually my PhD. But there were, when I was a student at University of New South Wales and Sydney University, there were political developments in Singapore which concerned me. In particular, the 1987 detentions, under the Internal Security Act, detention without trial. I was very disturbed by this developments in my own country, and that made me even more interested in investigating, researching the developments in Singapore that led to the government detaining these more than 10 Singaporeans. And I wasn't very happy or satisfied with the interpretation, the narrative put forward by the government as to why these people needed to be detained. And as I investigated, research further, I found that not enough had been written about Singapore politics beyond the government's narrative and interpretation of political events in Singapore. So essentially, those are the reasons that encouraged me to be a researcher, to become a researcher in Southeast Asian politics.
Thank you, Lily. Lily was motivated by incidents that happened while she was studying. Clive, you've been involved in Malaysia as long as Malaysia has been around, I believe. What made you start off researching Malaysia in the 60s?
I suppose Malaysia first came into my consciousness, Greg, when I was a high school student and in Commonwealth history in 1957, and there were a couple of new independent nations, Malaya and Ghana, and we thought, well, this is a sure thing for the examination at the end of the year. So I became first interested in Malaysia. I first passed through Malaysia, or flew over it in 1960, and I had some idea of what was there, but I became intrigued by the sight mainly from the air of what kind of a country and society that was below there. That meant that when I started my university studies in 1961 at the University of Sydney, I was really interested in history and anthropology, but Malaysia was always there. I owe my interest, however, in Malaysia to the year of study I spent in Jerusalem in Israel between high school and university. And I lived in a city where there were Jews, Christians and Muslims, where those three religions were side by side, but sometimes met, sometimes didn't, I became interested in those three faiths, in those three faith communities, the civilizations born of them, their interactions in history. In particular, I was interested in how people, modern people, could live with their sacred past and also with the traditions that had been built up on those sacred paths. And the question of Islam became prominent in my thinking then, but I was not about to become a Middle Easternist. In my studies of anthropology and history, well, I started in 1961 at university, the year after Clifford Geertz's Religion of Java was published, and this opened a whole new perspective for Australian students at the time to Southeast Asia, to Islam, to Islam as not just as religion but as culture and society. It was about that time also I became aware that this thing called the Islamic Party had won state power in Kelantan, the state of Kelantan in Malaysia, in 1959, a couple of years after independence, in opposition to the federal government. A political party based on the notion, it seemed to me, that Islam was not a residue of the past, but it was something that it was part of a reaction within the modern world to certain other things in the modern world. It was both anti-modern and itself modern. And so the notion that it was dying away was wrong, it seemed to me. So I became interested in Kelantan. To make a long story short, I couldn't get funding from Australia to study in Malaysia. Nobody thought that was important in those days. I then had to enrol as a graduate student in London to qualify for British and American money under the London Cornell Southeast Asia project to go to Malaysia, and I spent 2 years in Malaysia, in Kelantan, 2 years leading up to the 1969 elections, in which I was interested in the source of popular support for the Islamic Party in Kelantan. My academic career has involved me in deep and very often contentious dialogues, or my resistance to overpowering men who are great names in the field. Morris Friedman, a great Malaysianist, Clifford Geertz, with whom I spent a year at Princeton in 1972, and Ernest Gilner, who was my colleague at LSE, and in fact one of the examiners, and a very difficult one of my PhD thesis when I eventually submitted it. In short, then, I became interested in Malaysia and Malaysian society as a way in which somebody from Australia without a Middle Eastern background could investigate the question of Islam in the modern world, and in a way that was, if not pleasing to the people in classical Arabo-centric Middle Eastern studies, in a way that was relevant to Australia in its regional position and situation.
Very interesting, Clive. Now, both of you have spent, as mentioned, Lily at least 15 years and Clive at least 30 to 40 years in your respective countries' research. How have you seen research on the issues that you observe closely? How has it evolved? Has the number of people researching these issues expanded or contracted? Have the views changed over time? What is your feel about your evolving involvement in research in these countries?
Well, my initial research was on the Malay community in Singapore, and what precipitated my interest in writing my doctoral thesis on the Malays is that there had been no substantive research from a political science perspective on the Malay community. And that was of concern to me, because this is a community that had been lagging in socio-economic terms, in educational terms, and also had remained consistently marginal in Singaporean society for, even before the independence of Singapore in 1965. And reading the literature that was put out by academics in Singapore and others, official sources, I was not convinced as in terms of the explanation for why certain communities in Singapore remained along the socio-economic, political and educational margins of society. And in Australia, I was also inspired by the works, seminal works done on Singapore by Gary Rodan from Murdoch University, and quite a few Australian-based academics working on very much cutting-edge type issues, and challenging, in particular, challenging the dominant official narrative of Singaporean politics, society, history, economy, and culture. So in the 80s, there were these figures, there were these academics that wrote all these wonderful seminal works, and it kind of encouraged me further. Sydney University is also an interesting place to do work on Southeast Asia, work on Singapore and Malaysia, in that we have quite a sizable Malaysian community and Singaporean community there. So one is always in contact with these people that are shuttling back and forth. There's also the significant diaspora, not just in Sydney, I guess in Canberra as well, in Melbourne and many other cities around Australia. But I've since branched out. I now do work on Malaysia as well, largely to do with the fact that I think it is difficult to just work on Singapore without incorporating Malaysian history, culture, society, politics, and economics. It has been said that Singapore and Malaysia are like Siamese twins or joined to the hips, and other metaphors and analogies and so on. So so I think it's inevitable for researchers of Singapore and Malaysia, or working on Singapore and Malaysia, to consider the political entity, the other side of the causeway. So essentially, that's my journey. I now actually work on the Muslim world, focusing on Southeast Asia. What's fascinated me about my more recent work on political Islam is the cross-fertilization happening within the Muslim world, in particular Islamist movements and organizations. And this has, I think, been exacerbated by events pertaining to the Arab Spring. Many Islamist movements and organizations say PAS in Malaysia, other movements in Indonesia, in Singapore, are very much influenced by developments in other parts of the Muslim world, looking for models, in search for models, models that are relevant to the 21st century. So many are looking to the AKP in Turkey, for example, as a relevant and viable model. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that my research has expanded beyond Singapore. Singapore and Malaysia continue to be the focus, but it's expanded beyond to the beyond the shores of Southeast Asia, to the Muslim world.
Very interesting. Clive, if I can take you on this, you've observed very closely and intimately Malay society, Muslim society, through the Islamic Party. How has through your research, have you seen the Malay community of Malaysia, Muslims in Malaysia, the Islamic Party evolve, and in relation to some of the issues that Lily has raised about the rise of Islam and modern political Islamic parties and so forth.
The issues that Lily touches on are, are quite central, and they are the big questions of today, in some sense. Looking at the significance of Malaysian and Singapore studies more generally, I'd say I would say that those countries are and remain crucially important to Australia. What goes on there is important to Australia in ways that is far outweighs their importance to many other countries in the world. And yet, Malaysian and Singapore studies have very often been the stepchildren in Asian studies in Australia. The countries overseas that used to do lots of Malaysian in the United Kingdom, in Britain and Holland, have retreated from their past. Malaysian studies don't exist there. Malay studies in Malaysia is a funny kind of an offshoot of the old Orientalist. It's an anti-Orientalist revolt within an Orientalist tradition. Malaysian studies in Malaysia is a name. There are books on them, but they are the textbooks for the high school courses in civics. There are in fact only 3 or 4 countries that do what I would call Malaysian studies, and they are the countries outside Malaysia who really need to study and understand Malaysia. To some degree Canada, but mainly Singapore, which you get far better public discourse about Malaysia in many ways than you get in Malaysia itself, in New Zealand and in Australia. The consequence of this is that the Malaysian and Singapore studies are internationally not seen as the top draw and don't necessarily attract the top draw Asian studies people internationally. There's some very good people in the United States, but they look at Malaysia and Singapore as sort of the accidental way, the contingent way of looking at something else. But Malaysia per se is not their main concern. The irony is then that the places in Australia, if you want to know who the best Chinese studies person is, you compare them with somebody at Harvard or Yale or Japan studies. There's a great problem which I have had both as being evaluated and having to evaluate other people for universities. They say, well, we want to compare these people with the best in the world. Say the best in the world are in Australia. That's where where Malaysian studies is most intensively done. So Malaysian studies and Singapore studies remain crucially important in Australia. We have a need to understand developments there comprehensively and holistically, with people who approach things as Lily does, I do, who look at politics, society, culture, religion in an integrated way and not from the point of view of a specialist exercise in testing some particular theory in modern political science. What goes on in Malaysia seems to me to be crucially important, not least because Malaysia is now at a critical time of transition, where developments that have been proceeding for the last 30, 40 years are coming to the end of their run. Something new is about to happen. There's a turn in the road, and we really have to pay very close attention to see what turn in the road is taken and why, what the implications are for Malaysia and what the implications are for Australia. That's, for me, why Malaysian studies remains crucially important at the moment.
Thank you, Clive, for bringing the importance of Malaysian and Singaporean studies to the fore. How would you, Lily, encourage undergraduates or an honours student thinking about what research she wants to do, or even a PhD candidate? Why or how would you encourage them to do a research on Singapore? What is critical, or what is so important about Singapore that we should encourage young people to undertake research in this area, in your view?
Well, Singapore is in many respects a microcosm of Southeast Asia. Indeed, I would go further by saying that Singapore is in many respects a microcosm of the larger East Asian region. And you could say that for Malaysia as well. It's at a crossroads. It's always been like that, even from the colonial era, pre-colonial era. It's always been entities at a crossroads between East and West, North and South, and it continues to be that way. Now, I totally agree with Clive in his assessment of the Malaysian political scenario. And I would go further by saying that in Singapore, Singapore is in the same kind of political situation. It's at a crossroads, and at a political crossroads, social and economic crossroads as well, as evidenced by the elections last year, where the government, the PAP government, who's been in power since even before full independence in 1959, did quite poorly. Despite having the state apparatus and so on, it only managed to, it lost 40% of the vote. One suspects that in the next Singapore elections, scheduled for 2016, there will be further political and social shifts. And this is in step with the major significant systemic shifts happening throughout the East Asian region. So this is an exciting time indeed to study Singapore, Malaysian politics, history, culture, society, in step with the really dynamic environment in the larger East Asian region. I think Australians tend to underestimate the geopolitical, security, economic, political significance of Singapore and Malaysia. We are, like Australia, former British colonies. Most Singaporeans and Malaysians speak English. We share similar histories. And as Clive rightly noted, Australia is really the place to study. I would go further to study Malaysia and Singapore, but indeed to study the East Asian region. And this is one of the reasons why many students from the larger East Asian region, Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, many of them do their postgraduate studies at places like the ANU, Sydney University, New South, and other major universities in Australia. And I think the trend will continue. Australia has a lot to offer. There are dynamic researchers here working on cutting-edge issues. In particular, academics from Southeast Asia who are now based in Australia can't be doing the kind of work they're doing in Australia if they were based at Singaporean and Malaysian universities. So there is a critical mass of emerging academics doing that sort of cutting edge research at the ANU and many other universities in Australia. And you know, the old saying, it's very common now that the 21st century is the Asian century, the East Asian century, is very true. From the perspective of, say, Australia in economic terms, you know, the Australian economy is so tied to the East Asian economy. In cultural terms as well, I think there's not enough of that recognition that there is so much in common between Australia, Southeast Asian neighbours, in particular Malaysia and Singapore.
Yeah. Thank you, Lily. Clive, to close up this session, if a young Australian was contemplating which country he should focus, what would you tell him?
Well, I'd go back to some of the things that Lily was just saying. On the one hand, there are a lot of good, we say, expatriate Southeast Asian academics who are in Australia and Australians. At the same time, the countries of Southeast Asia are the primarily available locale for Australians in a serious, sustained way to engage with Asian culture and with developments in the region. The problem very often is that people think Thailand is so complicated, different language, different script. Vietnam is complicated. They look at Malaysia and Singapore and say, simple. English colonial background, everybody speaks English, you don't know to. Whereas, unless you understand certain things about culture, profoundly about culture and language and society, you will not begin to understand those Malaysia or Singapore. There is this illusion in Australia that while Malaysia and Singapore may be important, they're not difficult. And that's why we so often get those countries wrong. yet it's important for us to get it right. Malaysia and Singapore are, as Lee has said, have been for a long time a crossroads of civilization. They're also a crossroads, or the venue, the site of all sorts of important political cross currents, particularly those today of, on the one hand, democratization, the opening up of civil society, and on the other hand, anti-democratic forces, not simply the resistance to the democratization processes, but the way in which profoundly anti-democratic and anti-civil forces have moved into the spaces that have been opened up by the democratic spaces that have been opened up by civil society activists. And these are crucially important things. This is why Malaysia at the moment is at a crossroads. The first Malaysian post-independence political dispensation collapsed in what's called the Kuala Lumpur race riots. It was really a regime crisis of 1969. The dispensation put in place then was intended to last for 20 years, from 1970 to 1990. It has lived on an unnaturally long, a prolonged afterlife, really until the 2008 elections, when the writing was on the wall, that second post-independence dispensation is over. And it was clear the next 5 years would be crucial, the period coming up to the next election. That election is due this year or next, by June next year, and what the result of that election will be, how people will respond to it in Malaysia, in the region, in Australia, is going to be crucially important. And that's what I say, if anybody is an undergraduate, perhaps you should take the longer view, but a graduate student looking for a good subject to latch onto now, I would say look at the political transformations in Malaysia and also in Singapore as they come to terms with the worldwide democratic forces that are playing out in Southeast Asia as elsewhere, and the way in which established power structures attempt to either to resist or to co-opt or to accommodate to those things, those new forces, or else to refashion and reconfigure themselves in conformity with them. These are crucial times in Southeast Asia, and I don't think they're going to be studied all that well in many parts of Southeast Asia or elsewhere. Australia, Singapore, perhaps Canada, these are the places where these developments will be given their due.
Very profound views, Clive. And with that, we come to an end. Lily Rahim, Associate Professor at University of Sydney, Clive Kessler, Emeritus Professor at University of New South Wales. Thank you very much for speaking to us. Your thoughts are greatly appreciated.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.